Our next speaker is Anandi Ramamurthy, who's a reader in Post-Colonial Cultures at Sheffield, Hallam. She's the author of a very lovely and interesting and engaging and nostalgic book for some of us called Black Star British Asian Youth Movements, and has been involved in other great projects in this area. And she is also going to speak about this issue. Thank you.
I wanted to make about I think I've got about 5 different points, partly triggered by the description of the event today. And the first thing I wanted to say was, I think it's really important to remember, Balraj has already mentioned this, that South Asian activists in the 1970s and the 1980s described themselves as black. This was a political term which drew those struggling against racism together, building solidarity between those who had suffered as a result of the racism of the transatlantic slave trade and European colonialisms. And this identity was not one that contradicted with young people's sense of their cultural South Asian identity. So it wasn't, some academics later on in the 90s, Madood and others argued that this was somehow undermining South Asian identity. I would really argue with that. It's extremely important to remember that, and the power that this sort of sense of the black political identity had in terms of building solidarity, another point that Balraj actually raised. So the magazines that some of the youth movements produced, such as Kala Tara in Bradford, Black Star, Kala Mazdoor in Sheffield, Black Worker, really represented that. And, they were inspired by the principles of the Black Power movement, using the Black Power fist as one of their insignias. They felt a connection with the struggle against apartheid and offered solidarity for the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, the struggle of Palestinians in their national liberation struggle. So really kind of building connections. And, to bring it to Southall in terms of understanding the feelings of that time, I'm going now back to 1976, when Gurdeep Singh Chagga was killed. 10 days after that, the school children in Soweto were gunned down by the apartheid regime. And there was a real sense of connection and the importance to organise. And you can see this as a couple of years later in when New Youth Movement formed, one of their leaflets, I remember, used the slogan from Soweto, "Don't mourn, organise." Another point I wanted to make is that we've been talking about the first generation and the organisations that they formed. And yes, there were differences between the Indian Workers' Associations, the Pakistani Workers' Associations, the Kashmiri Workers' Associations, the Bangladeshi Workers' Associations that were formed before those of the youth movements. But there were also a lot of connections, and the second generation were very much inspired and learnt a huge amount from those activists in those workers' associations. And the kind of organisation and political work that they were involved with was also stuff that was, in a sense, connected what was happening on the street with things like the workplace struggles. So if you think about something like the Imperial Typewriters strike in 1974, over work intensification and bonuses, in the end, that struggle ended up being about workers' dignity. It was, Balraj mentioned that, they were taking on the conflict with the trade unions. The trade unions did not support the workers. That strike was sustained by the community, by community organisation. And there were an awful lot of young people that were involved. There were young people that were involved in offering solidarity in that strike that went on to say, for example, form the Manchester Asian Youth Movement. And in that strike as well, those young people and the the whole of the community were also involved in defending workers against the National Front, who mobilised, against the strikers. So it's really important for us to always see the connections, I think, between them. In terms of this question around self-defence, which of course for Southall, 76, and of course in 79 was a key principle, we should also remember that the Indian Workers' Associations, particularly that in Birmingham, the Indian Workers' Associations, there were many of them, and they had, they were slightly different, but the Jagmohan Joshi had links with, say, like the Panthers in 1971. They hosted the meetings with them when they came over to Britain. And they called for self-defence of communities right back to 1971. So that was another point I wanted to make. I think also when we're looking at the formation of youth movements, I think Balraj has actually already mentioned this as well, that in defending black communities, it wasn't just about, say, in terms of with Gurdeep Singh Chagga's death, they said, they couldn't rely, if you like, on the state, on the police and those forces. But also, one of the reasons for the formation of many of the youth movements was the failure of the left. So in 1976 in Bradford, this was about 6 weeks before Gurdeep Singh Chagga was killed, on St. George's Day, so it's quite similar to, in a sense, what happened in 1979. The NF decided to hold a meeting in a school in Manningham. And the Trades Council organised a march in protest. And that march, and so there were lots of Asian youth that were involved in a variety of left organisations, including International Socialists, Revolutionary Communist Group, Militant, who all came together, of course, marched into town. And then as they were marching into town, they realised that while this was a symbolic action, the NF were busy marching through the streets of Manningham. So they went back to Manningham to defend their own community. This was the first time there was a sort of what could be described as a sort of a riot in Manningham, with police vans overturned and paint thrown and the like, in order to defend their community. And of course, we've seen time and again how different communities had to do this. So that, in a sense, was from 76, and then from seeing, of course, the inspiration of Southall Youth Movement being formed some weeks later, Bradford Youth Movement, and then other youth movements formed around the country. I think, again, when we look in 1978, and the fascists organised a march on the 30th of April through Brick Lane, despite the awareness of the Anti-Nazi League, who were organising a Rock Against Racism concert, it was again left to the Asian youth to defend Brick Lane. So those self-organised grassroots movements have proved to be extremely important. And from those grassroots movements, solidarity can be built, of course, with other organisations. I think another important point is that it's not simply about fighting fascism, it's about fighting racism. It's the racism the community were facing on the street, in the schools, through busing, through segregated classrooms, racism in the workplace and amongst trade unions. So it was the racism of the immigration laws that divided families across continents. And that racism had been nationalised, as Shivanandan describes, by the British state in 1962 through the Commonwealth immigration law, not by the fascists. It was them, in a sense, who constructed these, constructed a law to keep black people out, despite the fact that they had British passports. So I think it's very important that we shouldn't be having organisations just about fighting fascism, but about racism, because if we don't, then we're not actually challenging the racism of the British state, who in a sense have fostered an environment that permits this. And we should also remember that Blair Peach wasn't killed by fascists. Blair Peach was killed by the police, by the racist police force. This is really important. So we need to talk about fighting racism and winning, not fighting the fascists and winning. And and I say racism and not racists, because I think within neoliberalism, we are almost encouraged to think on an individual level, and we need to think about this as being a structure of power. Having said that, I think when we speak about police racism, it's important not to speak of just the failure of the police to defend black communities or the failure of the police to deliver justice for those who have been murdered by racists, although this is, of course, important, has been important. But we have to address the racist violence of the police, like the death of Blair Peach. And so we need to remember Charles de Menezes, David Oluwale, Mark Douglas, Joy Gardner, Ibrahim Assay, Brian Douglas, and the hundreds of others that have been killed by the police, and with not a single police officer convicted of murder. So when I'm just going to make 2 points about the importance of the legacy of the youth movements. One thing, and Balraj has already mentioned this, is the grassroots nature of organising, which is hugely important. The importance of having organisations that were independent of the state. Through their work in the 70s, they were able to build a network, networks of solidarity, and really this came to the fore in the campaign for the Bradford 12 in 1981. 12 young men that were charged with conspiracy to cause explosive and endangered lives when they had been involved over the last 5 years defending others when they made petrol bombs, which they never used to fight the fascists in Bradford. And it was through a national campaign that mobilised all those grassroots networks, mobilised that network of solidarity, that they were able, that a campaign was able to be mobilised and worked with the legal team that enabled them to be acquitted. And the other thing I want to say that the youth offered at that time was their belief in what they were doing, because they believed that they could fight and that they would win. Thank you.